Greetings, ladies, gentlemen, and the rest of you. This is Jolly Scholar 888. Welcome to my Useless Eaters series. I'm calling this section Part 2, Abortion and Feminism. Why am I talking about abortion? I'm not really interested in abortion because, as hopefully you will begin to see, the abortion issue is not really about abortion at all. I know that sounds very counterintuitive, but I may convince you of it. Now, the overturning of Roe versus Wade, it will make very little difference as far as the fate of abortion here in the United States. The only issue was whether or not the federal government should have ever gotten involved in this matter in the first place. But either way, abortion as a social norm is a done deal. But the fate of abortion one way or another is not the subject here. What I'm looking at is, how did abortion ever become such an issue in the first place? Who promoted abortion as something good for women and as a public good? And how did the government become a vehicle to make abortion a government-supported institution? And most importantly, why? Now, this discussion is the when. When and how did abortion become an issue for feminism? But mostly it leans on the when. The why is in the next discussion. However, I think you're going to find this discussion extremely interesting. The early feminists were just really fascinating. Misogynist, transphobe, racist, fascist. So here we go, abortion and early feminism. Was abortion always thought of as an essential or even an important element of women's equality? One key factor I want to bring to your attention that you might not be aware of is that abortion was not promoted by early feminists at all. In fact, it was abhorrent to them. They wanted nothing to do with it. Even the most radical early feminists never promoted abortion. And the early feminists were some very radical people on many fronts. They never thought that abortion could possibly play any role in women's rights or that it would serve to empower women in any way. That is not to say, however, that they were not aware of abortion. Of course they were. They were keenly aware of it, and they spoke about it prominently. Abortion was legal in most states, and it was openly advertised under various names. But the feminists regarded abortion as a symptom of social ills, not a remedy or solution to anything. This would include Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. She promoted birth control, not abortion, because she considered abortion to be a criminal act. To her, abortion was, in fact, killing. Sanger was not even a Christian, and she felt that way. She considered the fetus to be a human being. To her, the conception to birth timeline was not problematic. The fetus was a human being at conception, plain and simple. It never occurred to her to think of abortion as having anything to do with women's rights. On the contrary, as all of her contemporaries viewed it, abortion was another social ill that women's rights and eugenics would put an end to. They didn't promote it. They didn't promote the procedure. They wanted to end it. We're going to look at some of the prominent early feminists just to give you a sample of what I'm talking about. And I can say, after studying these ladies, that they are some of the most interesting, dynamic women I've ever read about. I think you're going to agree with me after watching this. So let's start with Margaret Sanger. She lived from September 14th, 1879 to 1966. September 6th, 1966. So as far as the early feminists, she's not the earlier, but she's just right in the middle. So she lived right up to the 60s, the Cultural Revolution. If we argue that because of her cultural values background, her generational values, she could never have seen abortion in any other light, I would argue that she had plenty of time to come around to her thinking. Furthermore, Sanger and the other women of her times were far more significantly radical than today's so-called feminists. Today's feminism obsesses over superficial issues that are in fact an effort to remain relevant. They make up issues that in most cases are laughable. Well, that's my opinion. But it can be also argued that Margaret Sanger was not so much a feminist in the first place as she was a committed eugenicist and socialist. Her primary concern was the biological engineering of the human race first, and a kind of feminism second. I pointed this out in my last discussion. The improvement of the human genetic stock featured prominently in both her personal goals and that of her colleagues, with whom she founded Planned Parenthood. As a eugenicist and a moral person, it would seem, she was in her own way trying to improve humanity, albeit emphasizing the white race. She argued that improving the lot of women improves the white race, which in turn improves humanity. And it was in that context that she promoted the rights of women. These are her own stated opinions. You can look this up. It's not my interpretation. Nonetheless, she did differ with other eugenicists, her eugenicist associates, who thought that a woman's primary duty was to the state. But Sanger thought that a woman served both the state and the human race better when her primary duty was to herself as a woman. She evidently had a much more American, even libertarian stripe in her than some of her colleagues. Still, she seems to have absorbed the basic focus of the individual from the great American experiment, rather than the emphasis on the collective that many of her eugenicist colleagues were more concerned with. Her colleagues were more interested in improving the collective, meaning the white people as a people, and in turn, the state. It seems that Planned Parenthood was indeed, from the start, to be a tool of the state. This is going to be important as I move along in the discussion, so hold on to that thought, please. It is most interesting to note that Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, was always vehemently anti-abortion. She lived into the 60s era, just barely, and she never changed her opinion on abortion. But nonetheless, the irony is that Planned Parenthood today is the primary institution promoting abortion, and Planned Parenthood has become a de facto agency within the government. And as I will further demonstrate in part 3 of the series, Planned Parenthood was and continues to be a global socialist eugenics project. But let's pause a moment here to briefly go over what eugenics is, because be clear on this, Planned Parenthood is a eugenics institution. Eugenics is quite simply human self-directed evolution. By directed, the eugenicists meant deliberate engineering. Engineering, biological engineering, designed to create an increasingly superior human being, while at the same time keeping humanity from genetically degenerating due to the combined forces of the new technologically driven civilization, combined with the elimination of the aristocracies. The aristocracies were pretty much eliminated by the social revolutions of the 20th century. Aristocratic cultures had always cultivated human breeding as a central feature of their own self-determination. This would include control of directed breeding practices. But these practices and traditions are no longer in operation, and the eugenicists were keenly aware of that. So breeding programs were central to the eugenicists. Superior people should breed with superior people and refrain from breeding with inferior people. Inferior people should be discouraged from breeding at all. And as we will see, this would include sterilization and castration. Forced. This was practiced in Sweden up into the 1970s, believe it or not, as I covered in the last video as well. Breeding laws were proposed to keep lesser and inferior people from polluting the bloodlines of the superior peoples, but still allow them to breed among themselves on a limited basis, of course, as long as they, the inferiors, were still useful, still productive. And as I also disclosed in this last discussion, the gas chambers were designed for, another term they like to use was residuum, the dregs, the leftover, and unnecessary. Ask yourselves, what do you think Hillary Clinton meant by the deplorables if you think eugenics is not at play within certain political sectors? And while you're at it, ask yourself honestly whether or not you were among those who agreed with her. You see how easy you can promote fascism by cloaking it behind the term progressive liberalism and make it look virtuous? Come on, admit it, you lovely liberals out there. Many of you were grinning with delight at the thought of there being deplorables out there that you could feel superior to. Come on. Scratch a liberal and you find a fascist. Superior people would be encouraged to breed in larger numbers and they would be rewarded for it. But the truly genetically degenerate, the residuum, the unfit, the deplorables, they needed to be kept from breeding at all. Sterilization was a preferred option, but socialist eugenics, right and left wing, had no problems resorting to genocide if they felt the need. Also, by self-directed or human-directed, the eugenicists most definitely meant elite-directed. By elite, they meant the state. And by state, they meant the socialist state. All eugenicists were socialists. And again, whether communist or Nazi, they meant the state. The state would be directing the engineering of the people, whether the people wanted it or not. The state would be comprised of the elite. Okay, let's take Victoria Woodhull, 1838 to 1927. That was the feminist generation, slightly preceding Sanger. Victoria Woodhull was one of the most, perhaps the most, interesting, radical, and accomplished woman of an era that was already crowded with strong, dynamic women. Victoria was the first woman to run for U.S. president back in 1872. She chose abolitionist Frederick Douglass to be her running mate. Yes, she was promoting a black man for vice president in 1872. But that's not nearly all there is to her. Having been vilified in the press for her support of free love, by the way, that's her phrase. She coined that. Woodhull devoted an issue of Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, November 2nd, 1872, to a detailed account of an adulterous affair between a parishioner, Elizabeth Tighton, and Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, a prominent Protestant minister in Brooklyn. Beecher, brother of the Beecher sisters, supported female suffrage, but condemned Woodhull's free love philosophy in his sermons. By the way, the Beecher sisters are really the entire family. The entire family were very famous and well known as abolitionists, religious leaders, and suffragette activists. The famous book Uncle Tom's Cabin by the younger sister Harriet was just one of many reasons for their fame. Okay, so in regards to the publication, the story that she wrote about Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, a national furor erupted over the story, and U.S. Marshals arrested Woodhull, her husband James Blood, and her sister Tennessee Claflin on charges of publishing an obscene newspaper. The sisters were held in the Ludlow Street jail for the next month, a place normally reserved for civil offenses, but which contained more hardened criminals as well. Ironically, the first female president candidate spent election night in jail. But there's more. She and her sister became the first women stockbrokers on Wall Street, whom the business magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt entrusted much of his millions of invested money with her and her sister. And he had great success with them. And this is a time when it was difficult for women to even have bank accounts. But she was nonetheless, bank accounts separate from their husbands. But she was nonetheless adamantly against abortion, even while she advocated for free love during the height of the Victorian era. As I said, the term free love was her term. She coined that phrase. So she was for unrestricted recreational sex, but not for abortion. She, like Sanger, promoted birth control. Again, not abortion. And like Sanger, she was also a committed eugenist. A headline of a 1912 London newspaper article proclaimed her, quote, Lady Eugenist, unquote. Woodhull praised eugenic sterilization in one of her earlier books called Marriage of the Unfit, which I also referred to in part 1 of this series. So Woodhull was definitely in favor of controlled breeding for the benefit of humanity. But obviously she didn't have the racist streak that Sanger and her colleagues had. Her running mate was Frederick Douglass. Yet again, she was completely anti-abortion. And here's some of her excellent quotes. It makes no difference who or what you are, old or young, black or white, pagan, Jew, or Christian. I want to love you all and be loved by you all, and I mean to have your love. Victoria Woodhull. I am a free lover. I have an inalienable, constitutional, and natural right to love whom I may, to love as long or short a period as I can, to change that love every day if I please. She's interesting. I ask the rights to pursue happiness by having a voice in that government for which I am accountable. Victoria Woodhull. But as radical as Victoria Woodhull was, here is what she says about abortion. The rights of children as individuals begins while they yet remain in the fetus. I guess she meant as a fetus. Whoever has read the Weekly, that's her paper, knows I hold abortion, except to save the life of the mother, to be just as much murder as the killing of a person after birth is murder. Okay, so she's unambiguous about it. And all of the early feminists were unambiguous about it. They abhorred abortion and they considered it murder. Ladies and gentlemen, and the rest of you, the feminist movement of today has yet to produce a woman as radical, intelligent, and capable as Victoria Woodhull. I really recommend you read about her. She's really impressive. To this incredible feminist, abortion was just murder, plain and simple. It had absolutely nothing to do with women's rights, women's autonomy, women's reproductive health, or any other ridiculous made-up term to gloss over the reality of what abortion is. She faced abortion head-on. She faced the reality, saw it for what it was, rejected it, and moved on with the task of furthering the rights of women, which she did not consider abortion furthered at all. So now we go to somebody a little bit more austere. This is Susan B. Anthony, February 1820 to 1906, a bit of a younger generation. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, that was her lifelong partner, co-founded the American Equal Rights Association. In 1868, they became editors of the Associators newspaper, The Revolution, which helped to spread the ideas of equality and rights for women. Anthony was also a seventh-generation Quaker. So she was a champion of temperance, abolition, the rights of labor, and equal pay for equal work. Susan Brownell Anthony became one of the most visible leaders of the women's suffrage movement. And along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she traveled around the country delivering speeches in favor of women's suffrage. Okay, so Anthony was a champion of temperance, that's outlawing alcohol, abolition, the rights of labor, and equal pay for equal work. So this following article is from Feminist for Life. Admittedly, it's an anti-abortion organization. But all the evidence I've looked at is obvious. She was definitely anti-abortion, as were all of her contemporaries. Some present-day abortionist advocates they're grasping at straws, trying to present that or pretend that Anthony might not have been anti-abortion, as though it wasn't clear. But nonsense. It's perfectly clear. Early 18th and 19th century suffragist writings regularly refer to abortion as antenatal murder, child murder, antenatal infanticide, or infanticide. And as Durr, the lady who was writing this, points out in Pro-Life Feminism Yesterday and Today, these early feminists regarded abortion as violence against women and their children and attributed its practice to the denial of their rights and a dearth of nonviolent choices by women. In other words, they thought abortion was a symptom of many social ills. Sarah Norton, who challenged Cornell University to admit women, for example, wrote that she looked forward to a day when, quote, the right of the unborn to be born will not be denied or interfered with, unquote. Like Feminists for Life today, these early feminists saw abortion as a symptom of, not a solution to, the struggles women face. And the early feminists like FFL, which is Feminists for Life, sought to eradicate abortion by addressing its root causes. So we go on. Abortion, again, was not a feminist issue for Anthony. It was a medical procedure that was a symptom of women's inequality. The symptom, abortion, was something she obviously thought was abhorrent. She didn't think abortion had anything to do with women's equality or empowerment at all. This was typical of the feminists of her time. She saw abortion as a symptom of the social conditions that women struggled under, but she did not regard abortion as a solution to anything, much less as a tool of feminine empowerment. Abortion was child murder, infanticide, etc., and she and her contemporaries used these terms continuously. That's radically different to how abortion is viewed today, isn't it? She was also, for those interested, a lesbian. It was not a secret. It was called the Boston marriage, a term commonly used that referred to lesbian couples who lived together or who lived together with one then married male who went along with the arrangement. He was married to one of them. So the Boston marriage. Nice term. She had a crush on a famous, very beautiful firebrand adventurer, abolitionist, and suffragette named Anna Elizabeth Dickinson. And she was impressive. This is another very impressive lady. And we find this in the LGBTQ nation. Susan B. Anthony was a lesbian hero, but they don't teach you that in history class. And that's probably true. They probably didn't. The youthful lesbian orator, Anna Dickinson, hailed as, quote, an American Joan of Arc, unquote, during the Civil War for rallying the war-weary Union forces to victory with her fiery speeches, became the target of Anthony's affections in the 1860s. Dickinson was catapulted to national fame as the first woman to give a full-length political speech before Congress, and her motto, which appeared on some of her publicity photos, was, "The world belongs to those who take it." I like that. So here's part of a letter that Anthony sent to Dickinson. "I invite you to come to me here and sleep with me in my fourth-story bedroom at Mrs. Stanton's ever so many nights," she wrote, "to snuggle you, darling, closer, closer than ever." Anthony's feelings of sensual anticipation revealed a woman who was very much flesh and blood. Quote, "Dear Dickie, darling," that's what she called Dickinson, "I have a plain quarters, double bed, and big enough and good enough to take you in. I do so long for the scolding and pinched ears and everything I know that awaits me," unquote. So another radical, important feminist, surrounded by feminists and pioneers of the coming sexual revolution well before their time. Again, I don't point that out because I care about her love letters to Miss Dickinson. It's just that this is the kind of thing that liberals like to tick off. Oh my God, she was a lesbian. Okay, yeah, she was. But she still said absolutely no to abortion. Yet today, this is a feminist obsession. It's an LGBTQ ad nauseum obsession. It's now a transgender obsession too. You can't help but wonder, how did this complete reversal of course come about? So as you can see, abortion was legal, but Susan B. Anthony completely rejected it. Dorothy Day, 1897 to 1980. A somewhat almost second-wave feminist, a little later than the other three. A kind of bridge between the original earlier feminists and the feminists that emerged after the World Wars. She lived well into the abortion era that started in the 60s, the actual second-wave feminism. So she was exposed to the newer ideas around abortion. Dorothy Day was a dedicated feminist and a dedicated socialist, and also a self-proclaimed anarchist. She had a religious experience at 30 years old and converted to Catholicism. Dorothy was a radical social and political activist who experienced failed love affairs, suffered an abortion, and attempted suicide before experiencing a spiritual awakening that led her to her conversion to Catholicism. Day sought to force the church to be accountable to living in Christ's name, focusing on the marginalized and anti-poverty work instead of on specific practices like abortion. Ultimately, Day committed herself fully to Catholicism and an organization as an organizing principle for her political beliefs. The Vatican, believe it or not, was actually considering her for canonization. It's interesting, given her lifestyle up to her conversion and the fact that she actually had an abortion. Both the last two popes have mentioned her in public speeches. This is what she had to say about that. "Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed that easily." So Day feared that the pedestal of sainthood would make us mere mortals forget the many tasks at hand, the daily struggle of building a better world. On May 1st, 1933, a little intended jab at the communist colleagues, actually, she did on May Day, she and Peter Maurin launched the Catholic Worker newspaper, and it still sells for a penny, I believe. So here we see on our website the Catholic Worker Movement, and that's her at the top in older age. Okay, the biggest challenge of the day is how to bring about a revolution of the heart, a revolution that has to start with each one of us. Here you can see how she differed from the anarchist and communist colleagues and why eventually she went her own path. But she definitely started off with them, and this should give you some insights. So let's look at her early years. Dorothy May was born November 1897 to Brooklyn Heights neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. She was born to a family described by one biographer as solid, patriotic, and middle class. Her father, John Day, was a Tennessee native of Irish heritage, while her mother, Grace Satcherly, a native of upstate New York, was of English ancestry. Her parents were married in an Episcopal church in Greenwich Village. She had three brothers, including Don, blah, 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 blah. The family lived in Oakland, California until the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. And this is very important. It destroyed the newspaper's facilities and her father lost his job. From the spontaneous response to the earthquake's devastation, the self-sacrifice of neighbors in a time of crisis, Day drew a lesson about individual action and the Christian community. This seems to be the early life event that set the course for her life's work. She referred to this event often in relationship to her works and her beliefs. Okay, so let's focus a little bit more on that. The family lived in Oakland, California until the San Francisco earthquake of 1906 destroyed the newspaper's facilities and her father lost his job. From the spontaneous response to the earthquake's devastation, the self-sacrifice of neighbors in a time of crisis, Day drew a lesson about individual action and the Christian community. So she also noted that the Christian organizations just came forward, right? These are not NGOs that actually getting paid with leaders that get paid. These are just spontaneous communities. The Christian communities were already there, and they just went to work. So let's look at this. She celebrated the February Revolution in Russia in 1917, the overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of a reformist government. There's no mention as to what she thought about the killing of the Tsar and his family. However, in November 1917, she was arrested for picketing at the White House on behalf of women's suffrage as part of a campaign called the Silent Sentinels, organized by Alice Paul, and we'll refer to her later. She was a prominent American suffragette, and the National Women's Party. She was sentenced to 30 days in jail. She served 15 days before being released, 10 of them on a hunger strike. Now I ask you, what feminist today goes to jail, goes on a hunger strike? What feminist would not be out the very next morning? Day spent several months in Greenwich Village, where she became close to Eugene O'Neill. Those of you who grew up in the 60s know that Greenwich Village was a real center of revolution, art, and counterculture. Day spent several months in Greenwich Village, where she became close to Eugene O'Neill. Eugene O'Neill is a very famous playwright, American playwright, whom she later credited with having produced an intensification of the religious sense that was in me. He was very, very Catholic. She had a love affair of several years with Mike Gold, a radical writer who later became a prominent communist. Later, she credited Gold with being an indirect involvement in the beginning of the Catholic workers' movement. So even though he was a communist, he still indirectly guided her in her own Catholic workers' movement. Day maintained friendships with such prominent American communists as Anna Louise Strong, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and who also became the head of the Communist Party USA. Again, very different era. So as you can see, she never broke her ties with her anarchist and communist associates, and evidently they all thought very well of her and appreciated her different take on activism. I think the main difference between them was that at heart she was a spiritually motivated person, a spirituality that eventually led her to the full conversion experience. This puts her squarely in the traditions of the Great Awakenings. Her colleagues were mostly secular social activists. Now this bifurcation that began to take place from within the Christian social movement that were the direct results of Second and Third Great Awakenings will be the subject of another discussion of mine, the Into the Forest series. But here's another facet of Doris Day. Again, she's very complex. She's fascinating. In 1948, she took a brief sabbatical from politics to write a book that she titled The 11th Virgin. It was a rebound from her affair with a well-known writer, Lionel Moisey. Now, I took this from a blog. It's a personal blog of an online journalist. It's called personalist.livejournal.com. In 1918, when she was 20 years old, Dorothy fell in love with Lionel Moisey, a newspaperman, 9 years older than she, who was working temporarily as an orderly in Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn, where Dorothy was in training in a nursing program. He impregnated her and then bullied her into getting an abortion, an act which she bitterly regretted for the rest of her life. In his biography of Dorothy, Bill Miller, and he's a pretty well-known writer at the time, devotes a chapter called The Abyss to this relationship, including a reminiscence of Moisey by Ernest Hemingway. In his autobiography, the poet Kenneth Rexroth tells what he had heard of the Moisey legend. There was a group of girls who were almost all prostitutes who had drifted in off North Clark Street, lonely for coffee and company, as whores always are. Well, I don't know. In the course of time, they became the mistresses of various newspaper men, IWW, not sure what that is, anarchist and socialist leaders who hung around the place. It was called the Dill Pickle. That's cute. One was the girl of Lionel Moisey, pronounced Moise, the man who supposed to have taught Ernest Hemingway how to write. This is really curious. See how these circles intermingled. Hemingway, as you know, went off to fight for the Republicans, or at least cover the war in the Civil War in Spain with the Republicans, from the Republican side. So, again, this is very film noir kind of writing, ultra-realist. I don't include any of this for the titillating soap opera appeal. I'm wanting to convey what interesting, brilliant people these early feminists were and how broad their experiences were. They were complex, complicated people. In 1952, she, meaning Dorothy, wrote an autobiography, The Long Loneliness, where she includes her conversion experience. She was a fascinating, complex person. She devoted her entire life to social activism that, in her mind, would improve the human condition. And it began as a reaction to the suffering of the people after the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. But what really galvanized her wasn't just her compassion in the face of human misery, but the deep impression left on her by the people who immediately devoted themselves to helping the afflicted. That's where she found her own calling early in her life. Unfortunately, this is how socialism always manages to lure the best among the youth, and then, of course, betray them. That will be a theme I'll be developing. I will talk about one of my greatest mentors, who was a devout communist most of her life, and then she became more spiritual, and I saw how her communist and socialist friends openly ridiculed her. It's pretty pitiful, really. But in keeping with the underlying theme that I'm following here, the thinking of all the early feminists as regards to abortion, Dorothy Day was adamantly against abortion, even though she herself had one. Now, let's look at Sojourner Truth. Kind of imposing looking lady. Okay, she was born Isabella Blomfrey, 1797 to 1883. So she's very early on. She was an American abolitionist and women's rights activist. Truth was born into slavery in Suffragette, New York, but escaped with her infant daughter to freedom in 1826. After going to court to recover her son in 1828, she became the first black woman to win such a case against a white man. So this woman was not to be trifled with. Sojourner was a slave in New York, a state people don't usually associate with slavery. And the experiences she relates actually are pretty horrific. As early as 1799 in New York, legal proceedings to end slavery had begun, but slavery was not actually outlawed until 1827. Truth had a life-changing religious experience during her stay with the Van Wengenesis family. This was a Dutch family, and after she escaped from slavery, this is one of the families that she stayed with for a while. And she became a devout Christian. In 1829, she moved with her son Peter to New York City, where she worked as a housekeeper for Elijah Pearson, a Christian evangelist. The year 1843 was a turning point for Bonfrey. She became a Methodist, and on June 1st, Pentecost Sunday, and recall Pentecost is one of the fountainheads of all spiritual revivalist, spiritual movements. You need to understand Pentecost, even if you don't care about Christianity, to understand evangelicism, the Baptists, anything that has to do with being moved by the Spirit or baptized in the Spirit, which is the basis of all evangelicalism. So, let's start again. The year 1843 was a turning point for Bonfrey. She became a Methodist, and on June 1st, Pentecost Sunday, she changed her name to Sojourner Truth. She chose the name because she heard the Spirit of God calling on her to preach the truth. She told her friends, quote, "The Spirit calls me and I must go," unquote, and left to make her way traveling and preaching about the abolition of slavery. Taking along only a few possessions in a pillowcase, she traveled north, working her way up through the Connecticut River Valley towards Massachusetts. At that time, Truth began attending Millerite Adventist camp meetings. Now, this is in the direct tradition of the itinerant preachers that was a hallmark of the First and Second Great Awakenings. I talked at length about the itinerant preachers being a central feature of the First and Second Great Awakenings in my Into the Forest series. People who were not products of the theology schools, the foundations of every single one of our Ivy League schools, by the way. The Puritans founded Harvard, for example. These individuals were inspired by the Holy Spirit and set out to camp meetings and public squares where they preached the gospel. Women and blacks were encouraged to speak, and this was very radical. I and many scholars of American history make it clear that the First and Second Great Awakenings were directly responsible for setting the emotional and intellectual stage for both the American Revolution and the Civil War. In 1844, she joined the Northampton Association for Education and Industry in Florence, Massachusetts. It was founded by abolitionists. The organization supported women's rights and religious tolerance, as well as pacifism. So then we get to this. While there, Truth met William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, the famous Frederick Douglass, and David Ruggles. Encouraged by their community, Truth delivered her first anti-slavery speech that year. This is another of the utopian communities that has sprung up all over the Northeast and the West during the Second Great Awakening. I'm referring to the Northampton Association of Education and Industry. There was a lot of these utopian communities, and they were far more radical, productive, and interesting than their faint echoes, the faint echoes that sprung up later in the hippie communes of the 60s. These were way more radical and way more interesting. So her best-known speech was delivered extemporaneously in 1851 at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. The speech became widely known during the Civil War by the title, "Ain't I a Woman?" a variation of the original speech rewritten by someone else during a stereotypical Southern dialect. Now, I'll explain that in a minute, whereas Sojourner Truth was from New York and grew up speaking Dutch as her first language. This Southern dialect became kind of a hallmark of writers. Well, Mark Twain made it famous, and he would write in the dialect in such a way that by misspelling or spelling the words differently, you could see what he was talking. You could sort of hear how the people spoke. So he deliberately spelled the words in a way that you would read it as though it was being spoken in the dialect of a Southerner. And this became very popular. Now, I didn't realize that it not only became popular in literature, it actually eventually became popular in rhetoric. So Sojourner Truth delivered this speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" in that dialect. But it is kind of curious because she grew up, by the way, speaking Dutch. So she spoke English with a Dutch accent. And for those of you who might not know this, when during the proceedings of the Constitution, they had to vote on what would be the national language. Well, English just barely passed. German was right behind it, and English only won by a few votes. after German was, of course, Dutch. So she grew up speaking Dutch, and she spoke English with a Dutch accent, and she delivered her speech in a Southern dialect. Kind of cute. Anyways, Sojourner Truth was completely anti-abortion. Needless to say, completely anti-abortion. Now we need to at least briefly mention the suffragettes in England. That feminist movement was not a part of the Great Awakenings that occurred in the United States. So there was no spiritual component to it, or very little. There's no example of religious experiences guiding the activists, such as within Dorothy Day or Sojourner Truth, and really among many of them. The English suffragettes were more radically socialist and anarchist, and many were even hostile to religion. And that was not the case. Even among eugenicists like Margaret Sanger, they were never anti-religious. But in England, many of them were. Hence, there's no surprise that certain wings of the movement were extremely violent, as were their counterparts in other political arenas throughout Europe. Recall that it was an anarchist assassination that sparked World War I. Also, it is not surprising that far from the movement being backed and supported by many Christian churches in England, many church buildings were targets of arson and bombs by the suffragettes. Also, of course, government buildings were bombed as well. So here we get to Emmeline Pankhurst. I'm what you call a hooligan, she announced at the standing room only crowd of women packed into Carnegie Hall in October 1909. Hundreds more gathered outside hoping to hear the famous suffragette speak. The American suffrage and labor activists in attendance cheered as Mrs. Pankhurst, regaled the audience with stories about the fight to win the vote for British women. Although the tactics of the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, led by Pankhurst and her daughters, were often discredited in the United States as too militant, on that night her testimony met with approval. So now we get to this event, because it's directly related to Emmeline Pankhurst. Emily Davidson, who was a protege of Pankhurst. The incident took place at the 1913 English Derby, where King George IV's horse was running. The horse was called Amer. Davison ran out to the horse. Now, at first, a lot of people thought it was a suicide. They thought it was a lot of things. But as it turns out, she had some ribbons, suffragette messages. And she was trying to pin it on the horse, as crazy as that sounds. And she inevitably got in front of it. The horse ran her over. She died a few days later. The jockey, who's laying face down on the ground, he did live. He has some minor brain concussions. But the whole incident haunted him so much throughout his life that he later committed suicide. He talked about the look on her face, whatever, poor guy. But curiously or ironically, the horse went on, got up and finished the race. But the violence could get much worse than that, and it was perpetuated by both men and women, as I pointed out. The worst violence occurred between 1912 and 1914. I'll just read a little bit. It's not that important, but one bomb that was found in Smeaton's Tower at Plymouth Hoe during April was found to have "Votes for Women, Death in 10 Minutes" written on it. On the 8th of May, a potassium nitrate bomb was discovered at St. Paul's Cathedral at the start of a sermon. The bomb likely would have destroyed the historic bishop's throne and other parts of the cathedral had it exploded. This continued. There was a lot of examples. Some explosions covered with iron nuts and bolts, intended for maximum damage. They had bombs made out of nitroglycerin, which caused a lot of problems because sometimes they went off when they weren't supposed to. But just to summarize it, during the month of May, 52 bombing and arson attacks had been carried out across the country by suffragettes. So we can see that women of the suffragette movements were bold visionaries, daring entrepreneurs, and determined political activists. And they could even become very radical, even revolutionary, as we saw in the British movement. Nonetheless, even among the socialist radicals of England, where the spiritual guidance of the Great Awakening had little to no effect, the response to abortion was still unanimously no. If you don't trust my research, then do your own. I think you'll be forced to agree that this small sample of early and mid-feminism is well represented by the small sample of iconic women. Abortion was utterly rejected. So the early feminists, in terms of reproductive health, that silly made-up euphemism, were in favor of, 1, a freer, more active sexual expression for women. Maybe not quite the rampant recreational sex proposed by Woodhull, but definitely freer, or at least, like Dorothy Day, they experimented with it, or like Susan B. Anthony, chose not to indulge in open sexuality, was nonetheless hardly a crusader against sex either. In other words, sex out of marriage or whatever. They were for contraception, They were for birth control and even sterilization, which had a kind of sinister side to it, but not for abortion. Not one was pro-abortion. The early feminists, as well as the eugenicists that overlapped with them, were still consistent about certain central issues. They wanted to improve the social and economic conditions for women and to improve humanity in general. Abortion was not thought to make in any way a contribution towards either of those two goals. Abortion did not serve to improve the social conditions for women, nor did it serve to improve humanity in general. We have already gone over at length in the previous discussion, part 1 of this series, how abortion has done absolutely nothing to improve the socioeconomic status of women. Nothing. So we can't help but ask, when did this change come about and how was it achieved? And then the real question, why? Why abortion? Why, even after it has been amply demonstrated to have done nothing to improve women's lives, is it still being promoted with such hysterical fanaticism? So the time periods of the first wave feminism coincided with the second and great awakenings. Feminism, at least here in America, was a direct result of these movements. And really, if you look at Sojourner Truth and that generation, it started earlier than it did in Europe. The eugenicist component, however, was distinct from most of the Great Awakening utopia movements because the eugenicist movement, which was mostly socialist and atheist, was an attempt at a human self-determined evolution without spiritual connection or spiritual guidance. I covered the first and second Great Awakenings in my Into the Forest series, and I'll put the links below. It was from within these groundswell movements of the people driven by religious experiences that the driving forces behind every social justice movement in this country emerged, including women's right, until the early 1970s. Abortion was not driven by any of these social gospel movements, nor was it driven by any Great Awakening movement at all. How could it have been? The Great Awakenings were largely Christian. But abortion was also not supported even by the socialists and eugenicists of the time, as I just pointed out, including the far more radical secular suffragettes in England. So what did drive abortion? What was the force behind abortion that started in the 60s and culminated in Roe v. Wade in 1973? And as many of you probably know, the plaintiff, Miss Roe, became an ardent anti-abortion activist not long after the Supreme Court decision. Before we explore what were the forces behind the abortion hysteria, let's make a brief summary of what was achieved by feminism right up to and including the early 60s. So we have the right to vote in 1927, economic self-determination, starting with the Woodhull sisters and many other examples. Women started to open businesses of all sorts. They owned, inherited, and sold property, have private bank accounts distinct from their husbands, etc. Equal pay for equal work. That did come rather late. That is the 1963 legislation. But equal pay for equal work had already been pioneered by the early suffragettes, such as Victoria Woodhull and Susan B. Anthony and many others. It's just that there was a hiatus in the women's activism once the World War I started. It can also be argued that the marketplace would have taken care of that issue anyway, as more women entered and competed in the workplace. Then we have the 60s sexual liberation. But Victoria Woodhull had already paved the way for even that. But now that the so-called sexual liberation has become popular culture, we have to wonder about its benefits. We now have a huge abortion industry, as I pointed out in the last discussion. A far cry from safe, legal, and rare. Which takes us to the only real achievement. That was Roe v. Wade in 1973. Something that was never a part of women's rights until then. That's 150 years later. 150 years of feminist activism that did not consider abortion to be of any value to the movement whatsoever. Something's not right here. Anyway, so let's briefly look at a modern-day, relatively modern pro-abortion feminist, Gloria Steinem. Steinem was born March 25, 1934, Toledo, Ohio, the daughter of Ruth Renee Devayer and Leo Steinem. Her mother was Presbyterian, mostly of German, including Prussian and some Scottish descent. Her father was Jewish, a son of immigrants from Württemberg, Germany, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so we want to look at two incidences. First of all, she attended Smith College. She was a college graduate, and we'll come back to that. In 1957, Steinem had an abortion. The procedure was performed by Dr. John Sharp, a British physician, when abortion was still illegal. Years later, Steinem dedicated her memoir, My Life on the Road, came out in 2015, to him. She wrote, quote, Dr. John Sharp of London, who in 1957, a decade before physicians in England could legally perform an abortion for any reason other than the health of the woman, took the considerable risk of referring for an abortion a 22-year-old American on her way to India. Unquote. So her first claim to fame was that she became a bunny at Hugh Hefner's club. It's called A Bunny's Tale. That's cute. And she worked as an undercover bunny. So blah, blah, blah. You can read about that. And here's what she has to say about it. Quote, sexual exploitation at the hands of the patriarchy, unquote. But she had no problem, evidently, with strip clubs or prostitution. I don't know. Free love and economic self-determination is what it looks like to me. The bunnies made good money. No one forced them to do the work. Must have been a tough job, huh? How did the poor lady deal with all that attention and money? One can only wonder. So just look at that. From the radicalness of Victoria Woodhull, pronouncing free love in the way that she did, to Gloria Steinem making money as an undercover, fancying herself an undercover agent, exposing exactly what? The patriarchy? Well, we'll get back to that. But anyway, she did do something at least a little more bold in 1979. She wrote an article on female genitalia mutilation that brought it to the American public's consciousness. The article, The International Crime of Female Genital Mutilation, was published in March 1979 issue of Miss. The article reported on the 75 million women suffering from the results of genital mutilation. According to Steinem, quote, the real reasons for genital mutilation can only be understood in the context of the patriarchy. Men must control women's bodies as the means of production and thus repress the independent powers of women's sexuality. Okay, really? International? No. FGM is only practiced among a certain religious group. Patriarchy? Really? Don't all feminists today consider Christianity and Western civilization to be this abstract patriarchy? But nowhere in the Western world or anywhere outside of Islam is FGM practiced. Surely she was aware of that, right? So why has she since been silent on Muslim immigration to England and the US, where FGM is now widespread? Not brave enough to identify the real problem, right? Or where have we seen that before? She hid the problem behind this vague abstraction called the patriarchy. What the hell is a patriarchy, people? Do bovines have a patriarchy? Do lions? Do hyenas have a matriarchy? What does that have to do with female genitalia mutilation? The issue is Islamic practices and Islamic immigration into the West. That's the problem. The only reason she became aware of it was because it started to become prominent in the West, and then she did a study on it. But she proclaimed this was some international problem when it was not. It was a very specific problem. So where was she on the immigration? Islamic immigration? Completely silent. And we know why. She was afraid of her own colleagues, as are still so many so-called liberals. So she was astute enough to raise the subject. I'll give her credit for that, but not brave enough to go against the PC mob to identify the real problem. And because of this feminist cowardice and compliance to the party, FGM has now spread deeply into the West. On equality and the impact of potentially striking down Roe versus Wade. This is an NPR interview, so you can imagine. It's a huge impact potentially on women because we have to be able to make decisions about our own physical selves. It's a very differential impact on women depending on what part of the country they're in, what their economic situation is, and their race and ethnicity. It affects all women, but not all women equally. But I do note in all the surveys that all women are devoted to making sure we maintain reproductive freedom. It's abortion. It's not reproductive freedom. What is reproductive freedom? What does that term even mean? What does abortion have to do with reproductive freedom? It's a stupid slogan. None of the pioneer feminists thought that abortion was anything but exactly what it is, aborting a fetus. They didn't call it reproductive anything. Besides, she's free to reproduce. That's exactly what is not accomplished through abortion. Victoria Woodhull was all for free love and contraception, but abortion did not represent any kind of reproductive freedom at all to her. If we were to compare Victoria Woodhull with Gloria Steinem, I'm afraid Miss Steinem would come up dreadfully short, and it's going to show even worse in a minute. Again, what does this abstraction called patriarchy have to do with abortion? When half the women are against it, and not one of the pioneer feminists thought abortion was anything less than infanticide. Who and what is this patriarchy? Men are for abortion. They even outnumber women in the early stages of abortion. Not only that, but as we've already demonstrated, abortion has not solved a single issue it was meant to address, not one. I pointed that out in the last discussion. What a brave stance Steinem has taken, right? Now that the liberal mob has gone rabid for abortion. Then again, she's a college graduate. So we'll get back to Smith College. So here from their website, Smith College is a private liberal arts women's college in Northampton, Massachusetts. It was chartered in 1871 by Sophia Smith and opened in 1875. Now, Sophia Smith inherited a lot of money, and she was wondering what to do with it. She wanted to do some kind of charity, some kind of women's work, something. But it was actually a man, John Morton Green, who was her pastor, who convinced her that she should open up a women's only college. So let's go on with the NPR interview on the most pressing issues for women today. If you add up, this is this is Steinem speaking. If you add up in terms of the numbers of people, I would say that competing for number one would be violence against females worldwide. If you add up all the forms of violence, whether it's domestic violence in this country, which is at an enormously high rate, that's true. I mean, the most dangerous place for women in this country is in her own home, and she's most likely to be beaten or killed by a man she knows. Yes. Or it is FGM, female genitalia mutilation, or it is female infanticide or honor killings, or child marriage. Okay, so she's pointing out to some very good points. But tied for first place is the ability of women to decide when and where to have children, because that is a major cause of death. A major cause of death? What is she talking about? This interview is only a few years old. We have had a legal abortion, the legal abortion industry for decades now. What cause of death could she be referring to? Abortion was never a major cause of death even a century ago, much less post-Roe versus Wade. So what kind of nonsense is that? She's not aware of this fact? Again, see, we can point to the fact that she's a college graduate. She is simply pandering to the woke mob in an effort to remain relevant. And it is also, she's talking about abortion, a major cause of inability to be educated or to be free outside the home or to be healthy. Really? She goes on, I would say these two concerns, sexualized violence against women and reproductive freedom. Just call it abortion. All right, so domestic violence was always a feminist concern. This is one of the main motivations for the temperance movement. That's why most of the feminists were also wanting to ban alcohol. They noted, probably correctly, that most spousal abuse was carried out by drunken men. Interesting food for thought. But now that the liberal establishment is adding drug addiction and reduced law enforcement, even public rape is being downplayed by so-called feminists. Have you seen the videos from New York and other liberal enclaves? As we will see with the feminist betrayal of Europe, violence against women is rampant and either covered up or even condoned by the feminists. Young English girls who were victims of grooming gangs were shamed, not by the conservatives, but by the liberals. They were dismissed as addicted sluts. Yes, people, these were the words of a leading Labour Party feminist in England. Steinem keeps referring to this abstract, vague patriarchy when Islamic immigration is the issue. And to that, she says absolutely nothing. Even when criticizing FGM, she is careful not to mention Islam. She vaguely refers to FGM as a world problem, but it is not a world problem. It's a very specific cultural problem. And by refusing to name it, she helps to perpetuate it. Mass Islamic immigration is why FGM is even on her radar, because it's happening in the West now. But of course, she's not going to mention that fact. After all, she's a creature of the universities. And I want to refer to this again. If she's so concerned with violence against young girls in today's world, why was she silent, completely silent and AWOL on the grooming gangs of England? Didn't she get her abortion in England? Right? She got her abortion in England. Surely she was aware of what's going on in England. She doesn't even talk about that. She's never mentioned it. In fact, no feminists here in America ever talk about that. And if you look into it, you'll see it's absolutely abominable. She has also been conspicuously AWOL on the rampant sexual assaults going on throughout Europe today, as they were first revealed by the mass assaults that happened in Germany on New Year's 2015-2016. Over 1,200 women were reportedly sexually assaulted during the 2015-16 public New Year's Eve celebrations in Germany by men of non-European origin. Multiple women reported being raped. In many of these incidents, women in public places have been surrounded and assaulted by groups of men. This is right in the heart of Europe. This was unheard of before immigration, the immigration invasion. So she claims she's been looking at the whole world, right? But she didn't see that? Where was Gloria Steinem and the rest of the brave feminists in the aftermath of those events? Nowhere to be found. They said absolutely nothing. I'm going to do a follow-up discussion on Sweden regarding this issue because it's very critical to the eugenics and immigration issue. But for now, Gloria Steinem is one of the most prominent of the 60s cultural revolution feminism. Really? That's the best they could do? Just compare her to Woodhull, Anthony, Sojourner Truth. I'm sorry, she comes up rather pitiful, doesn't she? But to the credit of the feminists, some leading feminists were themselves puzzled by all this strategic pivot in regards to abortion. One of them was Betty Friedan, 1921 to 2006. This is taken from womenshistory.org, National Women's History Museum. Okay, she was a journalist, activist, and co-founder of the National Organization of Women, or NOW, which is very famous in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Betty Friedan was one of the early leaders of the women's rights movement in the 60s and 70s. Her 1963 best-selling book, The Feminine Mystique, gave voice to millions of American women's frustration with their limited gender roles and helped spark widespread public activism for gender equality. As of 2000, she wrote, referring to NOW, National Organization for Women again, and the other women's organizations as seeming to be in a time warp. To my mind, there's far too much focus on abortion. In recent years, I've gotten a little uneasy about the movement's narrow focus on abortion as if it were the single all-important issue for women, when it's not. She asked, why don't we join forces with all who have true reverence for life, including Catholics who oppose abortion, and fight for the choice to have children? Well, that's pretty radical of her. So everyone in the civil rights and the women's rights movements, I'm talking about the 60s, 70s, 80s, were not on board with abortion. What happened to their voices? We already saw in the last discussion that many black activists, Christian and non-Christian, saw abortion as nothing short of a genocidal scheme perpetuated by the racists at Planned Parenthood and by the government. Black Christians also emphasized their deep moral objections, independent of any racist considerations. What happened to their voices? Here are some staggering statistics on abortion in general and abortion in the black community. Okay, on the left is the Guttmacher abortion estimates. Guttmacher is a very big pro-abortion organization, but the CDC is supposedly neutral abortion surveillance system. I don't know that it is, but at any rate, the Guttmacher numbers are usually a little bit higher. It goes through all of those years. I just took a sample of between 2009 and 2019, which was as far as they have them, as far as they have them in now. So I thought that would be the most relevant. Between 2009 and 2019, 10,060,599 total abortions within the U.S. That is a staggering number. 10 million. 28% were within the black community, and they're only 12 to 16% of the population. So in their community, in other words, they comprise 28% of all of those abortions, which means proportionally almost twice as many as anyone else. In the black community, there were 2,816,967 abortions. So safe, legal, and rare has turned into well over 2 million abortions just in the black community. Yes, we'd have to agree that abortion has definitely affected women of color disproportionately. Third wave feminism. Enter the clowns. Now, this spectacle starts off not all that bad. I mean, they're cute enough. A bunch of women dressed up in pink pussy hats. I guess, pun intended. But it gets much better. This lady was a constitutional expert or something. Looking good. Nice. Imagine if Steinem wants to look at the rest of the world. Imagine the rest of the world. I'm talking outside of the West, looking at this. And who's leading this march? Oh, well, a Muslim woman in a hijab whose family are members of the Islamic Brotherhood. World Sharia is their aim. And this irrelevant Pop-Tart, a woman who made a fortune stepping on other women and acting like a tramp. Beautiful. Beautiful. What is so ironic is that if that Muslim woman leading the protests were to ever act like the tart she shared the stage with, or the vast majority of the women in the pussy hats, her family would have killed her. But this crowd obviously had no self-awareness at all. They couldn't grasp the deep irony of the spectacle of a mass of women dressed up as vaginas before the entire world. And who were they protesting? A man admired by all the women who work for him and know him, as opposed to the women he ran against, who was disliked intensely by all the women around her and who was married to a fellow notorious for sexual predation and even rape. The man who did more for black community than the black, half-black, president before him. Barack Obama is famous for having done virtually nothing for the black community in his 8 years as president. Yet, Trump was lauded even by his critics as having done more for the black community than Obama. Nonetheless, these vagina and pussy-clad women were protesting Trump. But wait, the clown world was just getting started. There's more. Oh man, it's too good, isn't it? Like I said, these people have no self-perception, no sense of irony. It's mass hysteria on display that is now being called mass formation, like holiness. No common sense. Gramsci and the Frankfurt School have succeeded. Common sense is an obstacle to socialist ideology. I pointed out in one of my earlier discussions that the elimination of common sense was a deliberate strategy developed by the communist philosopher Antonio Gramsci and then implemented by the Frankfurt School here in the United States through, you guessed it, the universities. I mean, really, look at them, right? I bet every one of them is a college graduate or in college. It's too good. I mean, really, this is rich. This is rich. So by any chance, does this remind you of anyone? Who can forget? So everyone, I don't mean to be too harsh on the last feminist waves, but really, can you compare them with the early feminists? So let's do a summary. Throughout most of the feminist movement, abortion had nothing to do with women's liberation. I mean, that sounds odd, doesn't it? 150 years. So as we've seen, abortion was not considered by the early feminists to be an indispensable necessity for liberation at all. It was the opposite. Abortion was considered by them to be a crime and or morally abhorrent, not a tool of liberation or empowerment. But by the time we get to the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, and to today, the new feminists began to promote abortion as a central pillar in their cause, and they promote it with what can only be called mass hysteria. But it was the early feminists who did all the hard work. They're the ones who broke all the real barriers. But even more importantly, as we witnessed over the past decades, abortion has done nothing for women at all. It did not solve a single issue it was supposedly going to solve. Unwanted pregnancies. Women simply undergo multiple unwanted pregnancies and multiple abortions until they finally decide, or are compelled for one reason or another, to give birth, if they ever do. Safe, legal, and rare. 10 million abortions in 10 years. We now have an abortion industry, as I pointed out in the previous discussion. Single motherhood has exploded, and the ensuing economic problems that come with it. Having children was never the problem, people. It's having children out of wedlock. The problem is single mother parenthood. The problem is single motherhood, not motherhood. People of color seem to be disproportionately affected. Oh my God. Well, here are the staggering statistics. 70% of all black children are born to unwed mothers. Where else in the entire world does this occur? The number of black fetuses aborted between 2009 and 2019 was a staggering 2,800,000. Safe, legal, and rare. What the hell happened to that? But there's even more cynical results. We now have sex selection abortion. Sex selection abortion is spreading here in the U.S. and rationalized by the same university feminists. I'm preparing a discussion on that right now. But for those of you who don't know what that is, sex selection abortion is specifically sex selection of female fetuses for abortion, precisely because they are female. But feminists in the West are rationalizing it. Surely, once again, the irony is not lost on you. But wait till you hear those academic feminist response. It's rich. Again, that's another discussion. I've already mentioned the grooming gangs. They have devastated white working class girls in England, while the feminists look the other way or even slut-shame them. public gang rapes and harassments as a new form of New Year's celebration among immigrants in Germany and other European countries. And the third wave feminists had nothing to say about it. Rape culture in Sweden is so intense that police warn Swedish women not to walk around alone and suggest that they dye their blonde hair black or cover it up. In other words, wear a hijab. Because the police can no longer defend them. While the Swedish government calls itself the first feminist government in the world. And all the while, the so-called university feminists encourage mass immigration, especially from Muslim countries. It's weird because they even select for Muslim countries. And they downplay rape statistics or mock women who raise their voices. I have some truly repulsive examples of Swedish feminism. Feminists who have betrayed female Muslim activists. That should really anger you. And that's coming in the eugenics and immigration discussion. Today's Western feminists shut down Muslim activist women who try to warn us about the problems of unrestrained Muslim immigration. Brave women like Ayaan Hirsi Ali are marginalized and attacked by Western so-called feminists. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, one of the founders of AHA Foundation, is a women's rights activist, champion of free speech, and best-selling author. She is also known as someone who speaks truth to power. Remember the white Jewish woman, Gloria Steinem, who brought up FGM and kept her mouth shut about what the root of the problem was? Well, Ayaan Hirsi wasn't afraid. She dared speak the truth to power, and she continues to do so. She's black, female, Muslim, right? Check those boxes, everyone. You'd think this brave woman would have been celebrated by our so-called feminists, right? No, she's vilified. She was awarded an honorary doctorate degree from Brandeis University that was then rescinded because of attacks from the woke mob. Where were the feminists? They were part of the woke mob. Brandeis is a Jewish university, no less. I mean, this stuff is just, you swear a fiction writer had to make all this up. Here it is. This is right off the Brandeis website. Brandeis University was founded in 1948 by the American Jewish community at a time when Jews and other ethnic and racial minorities and women faced discrimination in higher education. There's absolutely no self-awareness among these mass hysteric feminists, is there? Again, so much for today's brave feminist. And now, the new transgenderism hysteria is effacing girls' sports and the very notion of a woman as a category of being. And a black female Supreme Court nominee, nominated by what I'm calling the Democratic Socialist Fascist Party of America, refused to define the term woman, even though half the reason she was selected for that position was precisely because she was supposed to be a woman. And the other half she was selected for was being black. But she was selected by a president who had already told a black man to his face that he wasn't really black unless he voted for the correct party's president, which was himself, Biden. She was selected precisely for being a woman and for being black. That criteria was made public. Yet she refused to define what a woman was, and the president who nominated her made it clear that she was only black because the party said she was. And if the party said she wasn't black anymore. The social construction of reality, of identity. Yeah, from the universities. But the irony is totally lost on all these people. It's mass formation, everyone. Mass hysteria. It's really bovine behavior. But really, what we need is another pink pussy parade. And by all means, save abortion. But wait. This is going to start making sense. Are women, like the blue-collar workers before them, and like the black voting bloc now, are they becoming dispensable too? After all, now we have transgenderism. Who needs women? Much less women's empowerment. So the big why of abortion. Why is abortion a progressive liberal obsession when it has done nothing for women? How did it become subsidized by the government? And again, why? What is the role of Planned Parenthood? That's what we'll be exploring in the next discussion. Abortion and Planned Parenthood, the eugenics Trojan horse. Part 3 of the Useless Eaters series. But meanwhile, let's have another pink pussy march, shall we? another screaming naked women demonstration. We need more of that.